My name is Jim Hadley, and at the beginning of each of these 10-part programs, I'd like to just give you a little bit of an idea about the point of view from which I approach the subject matter. Museums like this display what are called, in the most general sense, works of art. But what gives a work of art its value? Why do we put it in a place like this? If you're familiar with the typical art history text, you've been led to believe that what's most important, what's most valuable about a work of art is what it looks like. Art historians try to convince us of this by talking above all else about things like dramatic intersecting diagonals, monumental groupings, lines, forms, and so on. Sometimes this kind of language can be pretty far from useful, however. Take this example from Bruce Cole and Adelheid Galt's book, Art of the Western World. Rationality and irrationality are woven together as line defines volume here and denies its existence there, as gold implies space in one spot and affirms a flat surface in another. Irreconcilable differences somehow coexist here. Would you say that this description fits this picture? Sounds like it could to me, but in fact, it's a description of this 14th century enunciation by Simone Martini. Maybe this is a little unfair of me, but only a little. I can just imagine Bruce Cole or, say, Kenneth Baker trying to describe a man who'd robbed him to the police. They'd never catch the guy. But the real point I want to make isn't that the language of art historians is often more likely to produce puzzlement or laughter than insight. The point I want to make is rather simply just that this kind of language leads us to concentrate on appearances. This is a problem because when art historians leave their books, as it were, and come out in the real world, it sometimes seems as though what a work of art looks like counts for almost nothing at all. For example, the New York Metropolitan Museum used to have what was supposed to be an ancient Egyptian bronze cat on display. It was one of the most popular items in the museum until it was discovered to be a forgery and immediately removed. Not because of anything connected with its appearance, but because it was made using a technique unknown to ancient Egyptian artists. The Rembrandt Research Committee is currently providing many relevant examples of this sort of thing. These fellows are trying to establish which alleged Rembrandts are actual Rembrandts. The Berlin Museum's Man with a Golden Helmet here is one of the relatively few well-known pictures formerly attributed to Rembrandt to be reattributed by them, and it is one of the relatively few quantum Rembrandts, whether well-known or not, still on display, although it too has been demoted from what Steve Martin calls Rembrandt wow to Rembrandt yeah right. Of the 12 alleged Rembrandts, for example, that the RRC says are not Rembrandts in the Washington National Gallery, only one is still on display at all, yet not one looks any different than it did before the RRC's investigations. We didn't see any headlines that read, say, Rembrandt found with diagonals that no longer intersect. Copies of Dürer engravings, indistinguishable from the original to the naked eye, are available to anyone with a nickel for a Xerox machine, while the originals are valued as great works of art. How can this be explained if the appearance of a work of art is the main thing that makes it valuable to us? What these kinds of cases illustrate is that there is a radical inconsistency in the way art historians do business. What is valuable about a work of art is obviously something much more complex than just what it looks like. We don't have time to go into this in a lot of detail here, but I think the most important factor determining the value of works of art, at least of the sort that get into art history texts, is what we might call their evocative power. Consider this case. Suppose you have a picture on your desk which you think is a portrait of you drawn by your daughter when she was 6. And then one day your now grown daughter comes in and says, Dad, I have a confession to make. You know that picture on your desk that you think is a portrait of you by me at the age of 6? Well, Dad, I didn't draw that. Remember little Betty Kowalski down the street? She drew it, and it's not you at all, Dad. It's supposed to be Paul McCartney. You might still keep the picture around, put it in the bottom drawer of your desk, sort of your equivalent to the depot where the Washington National Gallery stores its pseudo-Rembrandts, but your attitude to it has changed entirely. Not because anything about its appearance has changed, but because its evocative power has changed. Now, to an art historian, Rembrandt is practically like a member of his own family, and when something thought to represent him is found to be false, this changes his whole attitude to the work, regardless of the fact it still looks the same. But for the evocative power of works of art to affect us, for them to serve as the exalted souvenirs of the whole cultural context out of which they come, we have to be familiar with those contexts. We need to know about their subjects, the subjects of the works of art, and about religion, politics, the other arts like literature and music, the whole cultural package, if works of art are going to be anything more than collections of dramatic intersecting diagonals and monumental groupings, lines defining volume and colors implying space in one spot and a flat surface in another. This way of approaching the history of art tends to blur the distinction between works of art and historical artifacts, as they might be called, between things like, say, the Mona Lisa and things like, to take an extreme case, Napoleon's toothbrush on display in the Carnavalet Museum in Paris. And different as the interest we take in the one may seem from the interest we take in the other, in this pair of extreme examples, their value to us comes ultimately from a common source, their evocative power. In fact, almost anything old enough or evocative enough comes to be treated like a work of art, whether it was meant to be one or not. In the end, and I think this is an important point, history itself comes to take on much the quality of a work of art, in which we judge events not so much by moral standards, but by whether or not they are interesting or enlightening or moving. A sort of corollary to this is that something that didn't happen, like the Trojan War, can have much more importance than lots of things that really did happen, and Odysseus and Hamlet can be as important as Henry VIII and Napoleon. This may also seem like a rather extreme position at this point, but I think what I mean will eventually be both clear and persuasive if you stick with these lectures long enough. The general purpose of the lectures, then, is just to tell enough of the story of the Euro-Mediterranean chapter of this whole unfaded and substantial pageant that is sometimes called the history of civilization, to allow us to increase our appreciation of the value of the souvenirs of it that we have, whether they are works of art, music, literature, battlefields, buildings, tombs, or toothbrushes. Eh bien, mes amis, à la fin. Now, what I've said just now is meant to give you sort of a philosophical perspective behind the whole 6-quarter lecture series. And for the next few minutes, I just want to give you a quick idea about what we'll be covering specifically this quarter, a sort of preview of coming attractions. Now, although it is often argued that Mesopotamia really saw the development of civilization first, I'm going to start this series in Egypt. I don't think it's really necessary for me to defend this, though. Civilization did arise in the two places, from our perspective at least, at about the same time. If anything led me to this choice, it was just that the accomplishments of Egypt are so stupendous and celebrated. As Herbert Muller says, Egypt is the land of whoppers, and King Tut's coffin here, while not one of the whoppers of which Muller was thinking, is certainly as celebrated and famous a work of art as has ever been produced. It's been estimated that only the faces of Mona Lisa and Mickey Mouse are as widely recognized as King Tut's. We'll hear about King Tut, Tutankhamun, of course, but before we get to him, we'll also hear about the pyramids, and after him about Ramses the Great and the Temple of Karnak, and lots of other stupendous and celebrated things and personalities. We will get to Mesopotamia soon enough, though, and this is the White Temple of Uruk there, which is at least several hundred years earlier than the Giza pyramids, but lacks what I guess real estate agents would call the same curb appeal. It is at least arguable, though, that the Neolithic Revolution, that is, farming, began here before it did in Egypt, and that the first cities, properly so called, were here. Perhaps also written language, something more than just lists of goats and wives and so on, was first used here. Mesopotamian civilization lacks the unity of Egyptian civilization, and we'll hear about Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, among others. Of them all, the Assyrians were perhaps the most artistic, at least based on what we can conclude from surviving remains, but surprisingly perhaps they were also about the most violent people of the whole ancient world, according to their own accounts anyway. This is Ashurbanipal, the most famous of their rulers. They remind me of something John Ruskin says, "No great art ever arose except among a nation of soldiers." That might be hard to defend without qualification, but it's true there's no Parthenon on Tahiti. Mr. Getty, writes operas, but he has season tickets to the 49ers. Human nature is complex. Certainly in the Old Testament, the Assyrians come across as real bad guys. This is the famous black obelisk in the British Museum on which is depicted Jehu, king of Israel, in abject obeisance before another Assyrian king, Shalmaneser III, back in the 9th century. If this were just a history of art class, I'd have no reason to mention the ancient Hebrews at all. Nothing they made ever gets into a standard history of art. But they wrote literature that is essentially unsurpassed in importance and influence in the whole history of the world, so we will hear a lot about them too. In the late 6th century, Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered the whole of Mesopotamia and essentially everything all the way over to the Mediterranean. This brought his empire into friction with the Greeks, and we'll backtrack at that point to pick up their history, which is usually said to begin here at Knossos on the island of Crete. And for 1,000 years and more, a great civilization did flourish here, which ended abruptly around 1500 BC. Mycenae now, which you see here, was the most important early Greek city on the mainland, and as we'll see, it may have been an invasion from here that put an end to the civilization headquartered at Knossos. Mycenae was the traditional home of such mythological heroes as Perseus and Pelops and Atreus and Agamemnon, and it was excavated in the 19th century by the amazing Heinrich Schliemann, a figure of virtually mythological status himself. It was also Schliemann who excavated Troy here, site of one of the greatest things that never happened, the Trojan War. In their enthusiasm, historians sometimes give away the fact that they just really aren't as well trained always in the rules of evidence and argument as maybe they should be. To argue that finding Troy as evidence for the Trojan War having taken place is awfully close to arguing that because we can find Tokyo, Godzilla must have wrecked it. In any case, whatever the historical status of the war, it is of course very important because it is the subject of the Iliad of Homer, regarded by the Greeks themselves as their greatest poet. It was Athens that was to become the center of the greatest period in the history of Greek civilization, though, and indeed few other places and times have seen as great a concentration of genius as Athens in the 5th century BC. Some would argue that the greatest architecture, greatest sculpture, greatest drama, historiography, and philosophy were all a product of this place and time. And in the next century, Greece produced one of the world's greatest explorers, conquerors, and heroes all wrapped up in one person, Alexander the Great here. We'll follow him across the Hellespont and all the way to India on one of the world's greatest adventures. There will be a good deal of chaos in the so-called Hellenistic period following his death, although a good deal of fine art is produced in this period, and some individual cities like Pergamum will flourish in this sort of environment of political instability, until Rome arrives on the scene to conquer everything and absorb the civilization of the Mediterranean, make it its own, and produce the greatest empire of the ancient world, the influence of which is still felt today. According to tradition, Rome was founded on the slopes of the Palatine Hill to the right south of the Forum by Romulus and Remus, of course, and we'll follow its history this quarter through the early empire and wind up in Pompeii, where on August 24th, 79 AD, Vesuvius erupted, burying and at the same time preserving one of the most amazing archaeological sites anywhere. The American historian George Perkins Marsh says that an hour of buried Pompeii is worth a lifetime devoted to the pages of Livy. I think that's a considerable exaggeration. I have a lot of respect for Livy, but it certainly is, Pompeii, one of the most evocative historical sites to visit. Okay, then, that's the program in a nutshell, and now we'll start on page 1. This is Egypt, and this is the Nile at dawn, as it might have looked to King Tut out hunting the wild ostrich to take its feathers from it. Or as it might have looked to Cleopatra getting ready to go meet Mark Antony for a sail along it to a picnic on peeled grapes or whatever. This is the way it looked to Napoleon when one of his men found the Rosetta Stone just a couple of centuries ago, just yesterday from the point of view of the river. The Nile seen again here was the heart of ancient Egypt, and it really is still the heart of modern Egypt as well, though somewhat spoiled of its character by the Aswan Dam. The dam has prevented unexpected flooding and supplies a lot of hydroelectric energy, but its effects have not been entirely benign. It has, for example, by restricting the flow of fresh water, allowed more of the salty Mediterranean into the delta, and this has resulted, among other bad effects, in the virtual extinction of the papyrus there. This is too bad because no vegetable is more associated with a civilization than the papyrus is with ancient Egyptian civilization. But the modern Egyptian doesn't need papyrus. He needs air conditioning and computers run by electricity the dam produces. If it's papyrus or computers, the papyrus has to go. This is the 21st century. Even before the Nile was dammed, even in antiquity, it was pretty well behaved, at least compared certainly to some other rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates, which wander all over the countryside. I wouldn't want to make too much out of this, but certainly the conservative nature of Egyptian civilization is consistent with the character of the river. Typically, the Egyptians could predict almost the exact day the Nile would begin to rise, an event associated with the summer solstice, and irrigation channels would be open, workers ready, and so on to take advantage of what the ancient Egyptians looked upon typically as a welcome rather than fearsome occurrence, the arrival of the fertile silt-bearing waters from the south that would invigorate their land. In Mesopotamia, on the other hand, no one knew when the rivers might flood or where the water would go. There are ruins of cities that once stood on the banks of the Tigris or Euphrates that are now miles from them. And this sort of thing is likewise consistent with the character of the civilization that developed around these rivers. Mesopotamia was rarely unified for more than a generation or two, and the whole history of the area is just more episodic. This is a typical scene along the Nile today. When I was a boy growing up in St. Joseph, Missouri, on the border with Kansas, the Missouri River flooded, and when the water receded, a new channel had been formed, leaving the town's airport in Kansas. That kind of thing rarely happened in Egypt. That's a much more Mesopotamian sort of event. The Nile flows mostly through limestone, not through mud like the Euphrates or the Missouri. Beyond the valley, beyond the Nile Valley, Egypt looks more like this. For 100 miles to the east of the river and for thousands to the west, there's hardly a living soul to be found. Apparently 30 to 40,000 years ago, it didn't look this bad. At least grass and grain grew much farther south from the Mediterranean than they do today. The northern parts of the country, at least, probably looked more like a prairie, but by 5 to 10,000 BC, the climate had changed to the extent that most of the arable land was in the Nile Valley and the broad delta at its mouth. This picture gives you a better idea of the character of the area. Egypt was and is essentially a country 1,000 miles long, but narrow enough to walk across in a few hours. There were just two directions, north and south, with one big freeway from one to the other, and this in itself was a tremendous boon to communication and unity. It was impossible to get lost. Mesopotamia, again, was more like the LA basin, with roads going every which way, invasions by foreign populations, strange religions, different languages, all contributing to uncertainty, neurosis, and stress, or so one could argue. By 5 to 10,000 BC, then, the Neolithic Revolution had taken place here. Farming, the key feature thereof, was well established, and that is the sine qua non, the first sine qua non of civilization. If you have to hunt all over the Great Plains or the steppes of Asia just to find fur, edible animals, roots, and berries, you don't have time to paint the Sistine Chapel or build pyramids. By about that time also, the ancient Egyptians had begun to develop the second requirement for civilization, written language, without which the communication of ideas, discoveries, and achievements from one generation to the next could only be very limited. Here's a map of Egypt now, and by 5000 BC there were many settlements along the Nile, some probably loosely confederated, and by about 3500 BC or so, these had coalesced into two kingdoms, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. The Egyptians didn't know it, but their country was upside down. The south at the bottom of the map is Upper Egypt because the Nile flows from up there in the higher country toward Lower Egypt in the delta, which is barely above sea level. About 3100 BC, a ruler of southern Egypt called Menes in the Abydos king list, made nearly 2,000 years later, and likewise identified as Menes by Herodotus and Manetho, the earliest historians to write about Egypt hundreds of years after that, conquered the north. The south won this civil war. This is the celebrated Narmer Palette, found about 1890 at Hierakonpolis, the former capital of Upper Egypt. Narmer is the name represented by the hieroglyphic at the top. Scholars say that this is also the hieroglyphic symbol for catfish, which has to make you wonder, I think, just how well we really can translate hieroglyphics. Be that as it may well be that this is also Menes. First off, famous people are often known by lots of different names and titles. George Bush, the White House, the administration, the president. The point is that the fact that this doesn't say Menes on it doesn't mean that this is not Menes. It's been suggested, in fact, that the name or word Menes may actually be a title rather than a name. Maybe Narmer was the Menes, i.e. the founder of Egypt, the father of his country, something like that. This representation of Narmer is certainly at least consistent with that opinion. He wears the bowling pin crown of Upper Egypt, and he's clearly shown beating up someone connected with Lower Egypt. The falcon identified with the rulers of the south at this time is shown dragging around a bunch of captured papyrus plants attached to a human head, and the papyrus is almost always a symbol of Lower Egypt. His bully message is reinforced on the back. He now also wears the so-called proboscis crown of the Lower Kingdom, and he's inspecting rows of his decapitated enemies. The depression in the center makes this look a little like an ashtray, but it was actually a ceremonial cosmetic container. The Egyptians took cosmetology very seriously, and only very important people got to use the malachite eyeshadow that it once contained. H.W. Jansen calls this the first work of art to commemorate an historical event, assuming that Narmer and Menes are the same. But in any case, it's the earliest surviving image of a named person. It stands very near the beginning of the continuous history of Western art, but the bas-relief technique of the sculptor is very sophisticated. It is slate or something like that, about 2 feet high. This bas-relief medium will be the fort of Egyptian artists for the rest of their history, but Narmer didn't mean for this to go into some art museum. I think it's the kind of thing you would have wanted to put on the Voyager spacecraft, which is sailing off to other galaxies with schematic diagrams of human beings, the music of the Beatles and Bach, math formulae, etc. The idea is that if intelligent beings ever find this stuff, they will be able to learn something about the character of humanity therefrom. Though based on what was put on board, I think they might come to some strange conclusions. Voyager was meant to travel through space. The Narmer Palette was meant to summarize the character of Narmer and pass through time. It is essentially didactic rather than pictorial. It's like a big hieroglyphic saying, I, Narmer, was a hero. I clobbered the Lord Kingdom and unified Egypt. It's not supposed to show you what this clobbering looked like. It's just supposed to say emphatically that it did happen.
As I mentioned, the Narmer Palette was found at Hierakonpolis, and several other examples of even earlier, if not so impressive things, have also been found there, including the earliest examples of paintings on a man-made surface and the earliest painted tomb, Tomb 100 there. This is a section of the original painting that was found. The gray parts are the original parts, and this is a reconstruction of more or less what the original once looked like. One thing to notice is the so-called Master of Animals image near the bottom, which will recur in various modifications right to the present-day use of it in coats of arms. At the lower right, musicians are playing. The Narmer Palette is a much more impressive technical accomplishment, but it's true it was probably made 200 or 300 years later. In any case, it won't be long, in archaeological time anyway, before painting becomes very impressive technically also.
Now Manetho, the 3rd century BC Greek-speaking Egyptian historian I mentioned a moment ago, divided the reigns of Egypt's kings up among dynasties from Menes to Alexander the Great, in a way largely still followed today. Menes begins the first dynasty around 3100 BC, and the last pharaoh of that dynasty around 3000 BC was Waji, whose name is represented by these symbols on the so-called Waji stele now in the Louvre. H.W. Jansen is partial to the Narmer Palette, but W.B. Emery says this is the first great work of Egyptian art. This is a matter of taste, but this stele also certainly does illustrate well the elegant style and craftsmanship of Old Kingdom art. It looks a bit like a tombstone for a snake, but the snake is, in effect, the written form of Waji's name. Modern historians further divide Egyptian history into 3 chronological rather than geographical kingdoms: Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. The Old Kingdom is usually said to have begun around 2600 BC with Zoser, the first important pharaoh of the 3rd dynasty, and the Old Kingdom then, you can think of it as the Pyramid Age more or less, lasts through the 6th dynasty around 2250 BC. We'll hear about the Middle and New Kingdoms later. Here is Zoser now, and although he looks here like some grim old Macbeth hacked out of stone by a ham-fisted barbarian, by reputation he was much more an organizer and builder than fighter. In fact, Kenneth Clark says the history of civilization began in his reign with the building of the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. That's the kind of claim someone like Sir Kenneth Clark could make, no wishy-washy qualifying in the manner of lesser scholars who say things like, it could be argued that, or it has been suggested that. Just, this is where civilization began, take it or leave it. This then is the Step Pyramid, the first pyramid, though not yet with the characteristic profile. Before this was erected by Zoser around 2600 BC, there had been some small things built here and there with a few tons of stone in them, but this has 1,000,000 tons and it's as high as a 20-story building. It makes anything before it look like a doghouse. This is where we'll take the break now.